Think you need a hardcore family off-roader that can deal with craggy mountain climbs and smashing through mud holes, but also the boring day-to-day stuff that we all have to deal with? Well, we've got four of the most interesting players in the rugged SUV segment.
That's right, Matt. These four diesel-powered four-wheel drives all have 7 seats, but one is a little bit different to the others. That's because 3 of these SUVs are based on dual-cab utes, and the other one is the legendary Toyota Prado. The Prado we've got here is the GXL model, which is second up the model range and competes pretty close on price with the other vehicles here, despite being positioned as a cut above and having permanent four-wheel drive. It's the most popular variant in the Prado range, which is why it's here. Against it, we've got 3 ute-based SUVs. All of them are the range-topping variants in their lineups, because that's what you asked for following our previous off-road SUV comparison test. The Toyota Fortuner Crusade is one of those models. This is the highest spec version of the Hilux-based SUV, and it's recently been updated with new tech. Also here is the Ford Everest, which we've got in top-spec titanium trim, with the bi-turbo 2-litre engine, and also with permanent four-wheel drive. We've known it's a good unit for a while, but let's see if it can live up to its price. We'll get to that in a second. And finally, we've got our carryover champ, the Mitsubishi Pajero Sport, which has also scored a few updates for 2020. This time it's the flagship Exceed variant we've chosen, because the other vehicles in this test are getting up there on price too.
The question is then, do you go for the Prado or one of the other ute-based SUVs? Well, in this test, we're going to go through a bunch of different day-to-day criteria: practicality, safety, value for money, fuel economy, and also how they drive on-road and how they drive off-road. But that'll be Crafty's job.
Yeah, and that's going to be a lot of fun, Matt. But before you have a go at us in the comments section, make sure you read our full yarn at the CarsGuide website. The link is in the description below. And if you're watching this on YouTube, hit like, share it with your mates, hit subscribe, and that way you'll stay up to date with all of our reviews.
First up, we'll consider what each of these SUVs costs. There's a bit of a spread when it comes to the pricing of these models. We've got a lower grade Prado GXL up against the range-topping models of each of the other vehicles. Close to it on price is the Fortuner Crusade. It's a bit smaller and has a smaller price tag as a result. We'll see if it can stack up in other ways soon. The Pajero Sport Exceed looks really strong value, and it is. It's the most affordable of these vehicles and comes loaded with equipment. And at the other end of the scale is the Ford Everest Titanium. It's expensive in this company, coming in more than 15 grand over the Pajero Sport. But there's a reason it costs that much. Check out the CarsGuide site for a comprehensive equipment breakdown across all of these models. Let's take a look at the practicality on offer. Each of these large SUVs has 7 seats, but there are some marked differences when it comes to the usefulness and usability of each of these models. We attempted to fit the same stuff in each of these models, the CarsGuide pram and some suitcases. You can read the full review for all the boot capacity figures, but here's a quick look at the backsides of each of these buses. You can see for yourself that the Fortuner's awkward side-folding seats never allow you to use the full width of the boot. Well, that's in 5-seat guys anyway. But the Fortuner's third-row storage space is surprisingly accommodating, fitting 2 of our cases and also the bulky CarsGuide pram with ease. The Prado gets smarter rear seats than the Fortuner, and that means its boot space is a bit more usable on the whole. Well, it is with 5 seats in play anyway. In 7-seat layout, there's not very much space behind the back row at all. In fact, it was the only one of these SUVs that couldn't fit the CarsGuide pram in the boot in 7-seat layout. The Pajero Sport has a weird third-row layout that means you have to flip the third-row seat bases forward before you can lower the back seats. Other grades in the lineup only have 5 seats, but if you get a 7-seater and you plan to use 7 seats often, there's enough space for a pram or a large suitcase, but it is a touch narrow. And the Everest, like the Prado, is neater with the third row stored. It also has a low load-in height and flat folding rear seats, which in this spec are electrically adjustable. It gets very clever packaging, and the smarts of this car can't be underestimated. It can cope with either a small and mid-size case or a large one in the third row, and it fit the pram without much hassle at all. It's very clever indeed. Someone had to draw the short straw and be our third row tester here, and this time it was Mitch. It was Mitch last time as well, about a year ago when we did this test. He was our third row gopher, and while he may have grown as a man, he hasn't grown physically that much. So he's about the size of a larger child, and that's good for us to see which one was the least comfortable and which one was the most comfortable. So Mitch, over to you. Tell us which was least comfy.
So coming in at last is the Fortuner. It had the roughest ride of the group, and that just results in a very uncomfortable time for anyone stuck in the back. The Prado comes in at third. It has one of the best entry and exits, but it is lacking a bit of headroom. It's a tight contest between the Pajero Sport and the Everest. The Mitsubishi has the best headroom of the group. However, setting up those third row seats is a bit finicky. But if I had to spend a few hours in one of them, it would be the Everest. It has the most comfortable seats and the softest suspension.
Okay, so we've got an idea of the third row. Now we'll take a look at second row space, starting in the Prado. Our Prado is the GXL, and that means it gets 3-zone climate control, so you can set the temperature differently in the back to what you would in the front. Plus, because our car has the premium pack, it gets heated second row seats as well. And the space is good for adults, especially for headroom and legroom. The mesh mat pockets are a bit silly, and so are the centre armrest cup holders, but the sliding second row seat isn't. Just like the front seat, the rear of the Fortuner feels a bit narrow and the seat base is quite flat, and anyone taller might feel a little cramped. It still has a sliding second row to allow for space behind, and there's a 12 volt and 220 volt power point. There are roof mounted air vents, and it also has shopping bag hooks on the backs of the front seats. Seat space in the second row of the Pajero Sport is a little tight for knee space, but headroom is okay. The issue with this one is it doesn't have a sliding second row, so this is it when it comes to space. And the third row is rendered almost useless if you have child seats in the second row, because the second row top tether points are in the rear ceiling. There are dual USB ports and a power point to keep things charged. The front seats don't have hard backs, but the materials are nice and the seats are comfy. The Everest could be better for headroom if you're a tall adult, but the knee room and toe room is very good. There's a sliding second row and it offers good practicality, plus there are no hard finishes on the seat backs, so you might want to keep the kids under control. The seat is a bit flat, but there's a flip down armrest, a power point and a 12 volt. Plus, there's a third climate zone, but no temperature display. And it's the only SUV here with top tether points in the third row. All models here have ISOVIX child seat anchors and top tether points as well. Let's take a look at some of the features up front in these family SUVs, and we'll start with the Prado. The interior of the Prado feels a lot wider. It feels like there's more real estate in here, and that's because there's a lot more usability to the cabin than in the Fortuner, for instance, because you get the same sort of size of screen, but you do get these hard buttons and dials on the side that allow you easier control. It's kind of like one of those phones for old people with the big digit things, so you can press it a bit easier. It's very easy to use and everything's very logically laid out. And this car also has a premium interior pack, so it's got heated and cooled front seats and heated rear seats as well, and that's why it's got perforated leather as well over the Fortuner. And generally, the layout of everything in here is very, very intuitive. You'll get to know it very well, and if you've never sat in a Prado before, it's not going to take you by surprise because everything is just where it should be. And the storage is good too. You've got a good storage bin in front of the shifter here. There's also a pair of cup holders. There's a sort of weird L-shaped storage bin down here as well, and the biggest center console bin of these ones, and it's also cooled, so you could put muesli bars in there, for instance. The interior space of the Fortuner isn't the best here. The design does eat into the space a little bit. These large, I don't know what you even call them, they sort of stick out in front of the dashboard, and it does mean that it feels like you're a bit pushed back in your seat. You're also quite close to the person next to you because it's quite a narrow cabin. And there are some other shortfalls when it comes to the cabin as well. There's not much in the way of loose item storage down here. You get a pair of cup holders and a smallish center bin, but you do get a bit more extra space up here where you get a dual glove box, which can be pretty handy if you've got something that'll fit in there, like a bottle or a can of Coke or something like that. The dash design is okay. There's no digital speedo. It's the only one in this test that doesn't have that technology. That can be annoying if you are watching your speed. If you drive in a state like Victoria, for example, where speed limits are very strict, then that could be a bit of an issue. Also, I'm not really sold on this little bit of extra speaker stuff on top of the dashboard. It kind of just gets in your peripheral vision and it's not pretty either. There are heated seats in this top spec model, but it's only one setting. They're either on or they're off, and you only get single zone climate control for the entire car. And when it comes to the screen, it's a 7-inch touchscreen system. Can be a little bit hard to get used to because there's no volume knob. It's just touch buttons on the side, and they're not hard buttons like you get in the Prado either. So it can take some learning. Plus there's none of the latest smartphone connectivity in the way of Apple CarPlay or Android Auto. So it's pretty behind in that regard. The interior of the Pajero Sport Exceed has stepped up a bit in this latest iteration version. The last one we had was pretty good, but this one's even better because it's got a bigger screen with inbuilt sat-nav as well as Apple CarPlay and Android Auto, so you can pretty much choose which mapping system you get to use. There's also a nice big digital driver information screen with a big digital speedo, so you can keep an eye on your pace and keep it under control. There are some other elements which could be better. Storage, for instance. There's a pair of cup holders, a smallish center bin, and a small cubby under the dash here, and another sort of section down under the transmission, but that's a little bit useless. So it's not as good as it could be when it comes to storage. But the presentation is really nice. There's lots of nice materials. The leather on the seats feels really good, and the seat comfort is really good as well. Plus, the steering wheel feels nice in the hand, and it's also got paddle shifters, so you can get sporty. The interior of the Ford Everest Titanium definitely feels more upmarket than its competitors because it's more expensive and it feels it as well. It doesn't quite have the same width of cabin as the Prado does, but it definitely feels substantial in here. There's some really nice design cues, including this painted finish across the dashboard, which even spells out that you're in an Everest and not a Ranger in case you were confused. But otherwise, there are some Rangery elements in here. You've got the same sort of media screen with the same controls underneath, but we did have a few issues with the screen's reactiveness and its speed when it came to touch response. Can be a little bit slow to load, but there's a nice digital driver information set up in front of you with the digital speedo. There's also decent storage, a pair of cup holders, a bit of a storage bin down here as well, and a reasonably sized center console bin. The seats are really comfy. They're heated in this spec as well, and because you're getting the top spec model, you're also getting a huge panoramic roof, which is quite nice.
These family-focused SUVs are rugged and practical, sure, but safety is a crucial consideration. Here's a rundown of the safety equipment on each of these particular variants. All of these models have a reversing camera, but only the Mitsubishi has a surround view 360-degree camera. The Mitsubishi and Ford also have front and rear parking sensors, where the others make do with rear sensors only. All four have 7 airbags, including driver's knee coverage and third row airbag protection too, which is good for family buyers. Plus, all of these models have auto emergency braking, but not all AEB is created equal. The Mitsubishi's system only works to detect vehicles, where the Ford and both Toyotas have pedestrian detection, and the Fortuner even has daytime cyclist recognition. But while all of them have lane departure warning, only the Ford can actively steer you back into your lane. And both the Ford and Mitsubishi have blind spot monitoring and rear cross traffic alert, which both the Toyotas miss out on. The ANCAP ratings are all the same despite being tested almost a decade apart. You can read more details about the safety of each of these models at the CarsGuide site.
You might be wondering which one of these models has the most power and torque. Well, it's the one with the smallest engine capacity of the lot. That's right, the Ford Everest Titanium comes with a 2-litre bi-turbo 4-cylinder engine, but it punches quite a bit harder for power and torque than its competitors, as you can see on your screen. It also has the most gears, but all 4 vehicles here are automatic and have 4-wheel drive. But as we mentioned earlier, the Prado and Everest both have permanent 4-wheel drive, while the others have selectable 4-wheel drive. For this test, we went for an urban driving loop and also a highway driving loop in each of these 4 SUVs to see which one coped with roundabouts, traffic lights, speed humps, and also twisty roads and mixed surfaces. And it wasn't just me driving each of these cars by myself. We had someone in each of the 3 rows of these 4 SUVs to give you an idea of which struck the best balance in a mix of driving situations. And here's what we found. The Toyota Fortuner ranked last for on-road driving. The suspension is best described as unpleasant, with a fierce ride compared to the other SUVs here. It was especially bad on coarse chip roads, feeling choppy and unpleasant no matter which row you were sitting in. Its steering was decently responsive and nicely weighted though, with good feel through the wheel for the driver. And its engine was eager too. It's one of the lightest of these 4 SUVs and certainly felt zestier in its response. The 6-speed auto was effective at lower speeds but could be a bit fussy at highway pace, especially in undulating terrain. It was noisier than its rivals, with more vibrations and harshness evident. Put it this way, the Fortuner was the one we all wanted to get out of most. There weren't as many complaints in the Prado, which is wider than its rivals and feels more planted as a result. The wider track gives it a more sure-footed feel on all surfaces at all speeds, and in combination with its permanent 4-wheel drive system, this is a very confident feeling vehicle. Its steering is slower than the Fortuner though, and it can feel a bit bigger when you're trying to negotiate tight streets. The engine doesn't feel nearly as punchy in the Prado as it does in the Fortuner too. With the same power and torque outputs, we'd describe progress as more leisurely in the Prado because it weighs a couple of 100 kilos more than the Fortuner. It was considerably more refined than its stablemate and was a lot more agreeable for our testers in on-road driving conditions. The Mitsubishi Pajero Sport was also nicely refined and mostly pleasant in day-to-day driving. Its ride can be a little bit jittery over some surfaces, but for the most part, our testers found the suspension to be mostly well sorted. For the driver, there's nicely weighted steering that offers good response and feel, and it has the tightest turning circle of these 4 SUVs too, so it could be very city friendly. Its engine's quiet, but the response isn't as urgent. It doesn't feel slow at all, but it's not eager to jump away from a standstill. Even so, the 8-speed auto is smooth and smart, and the Pajero Sport was largely very good across the board, but it wasn't the best in this test. The winner for our on-road section in this comparison test is the Ford Everest Titanium. It's the most enjoyable, the most comfortable, the most livable, and the most relaxing of these 4 SUVs to drive. Part of that comes down to the fact that it's got light and accurate steering that is very trustworthy. It's not tedious like some of the other SUVs in this test, and it never feels like a chore to drive. And that's also down to the suspension comfort and control. It never feels like it's too choppy and too bouncy. It does have bigger wheels than some of the lower models in the range, so the ride is impacted just a little bit by those bigger wheels, but it's never to the point where you think it's uncomfortable, and it's never unsettled either. Other things that we really liked about the Everest Titanium is the level of refinement. There's not too much noise from the engine, and that's a good thing. There's not too much road noise or too much wind noise either. And that engine, well, it's a 2-litre bi-turbo 4-cylinder, and it easily has the most pulling power of these 4 SUVs. It feels more urgent, and while the transmission does have a lot of gears to play with, there's 10 speeds, it does a good job of harnessing the power, even if there is a little bit of chopping and changing at lower speeds when you think it probably could just hold onto a gear and keep moving. Some people will hate the engine's stop-start system, but thankfully there is a button to turn it off if it annoys you. But generally, on the whole, this is such an impressive vehicle because it does everything you expect, it doesn't offend you, and as family transport, when you're just driving around town or if you're on the highway, it shows why it's our winner of the on-road part of this test.
All of these vehicles have proven four-wheel drive systems as well as decent ground clearance, wheel travel and off-road measures for vehicles that aren't intended to be hardcore off-roaders. For all of those details and much more, read the full comparison at the CarsGuide site. We wanted to see how these four-wheel drive wagons compare when it comes to tackling the rough stuff, so we drove them all on the same terrain in the same conditions back to back to get an idea of how they all handled themselves. Our set-piece hill climb is at the outer limits of what a showroom standard four-wheel drive wagon could be reasonably expected to cope with, and to their credit, all of these vehicles successfully tackled it. Each vehicle's full complement of off-road weaponry, low-range gearing, diff locks, the whole lot was needed to drive the full length of this hill. Here's how our off-road testing panned out. The Fortuner and the Pajero Sport are evenly matched, and they are at the back of this pack. Neither of them are particularly bad at anything, but they're never as composed as the Everest or the Prado. Fortuner was a real surprise in that it seemed to handle these tougher tracks better than it recently handled less severe conditions. There's ample low-end torque and the Fortuner's mechanicals are all fine, but it does feel low and long, and there was a bit of sidestep grinding and belly scraping through the deeper, sharply angled ruts. But that was the case for all of these four-wheel drives. Now the Fortuner is a harsh riding four-wheel drive in general, so getting to and from your favourite off-roading spot could be pretty punishing. But it is very effective in low-speed, low-range off-roading. It almost always wins, but it wins ugly. It's lighter and narrower than the rest of this pack, and the Pajero Sport is more easily unsettled than the others through very severe and deep ruts. But it's also among the easiest here to position right where you want it on the track because visibility is so good, and the Pajero Sport feels really dialed into the terrain. Another bonus is the fact that its off-road modes and Super Select 2 four-wheel drive system are supremely effective, and it's a setup I've praised in other reviews. The Sport's engine and auto combination are good with plenty of usable torque and a transmission that's never scrambling for the sweet spot. The Pajero Sport didn't have as much wheel articulation as the others, and during one big drop into a deep rut, there was pronounced back-end lift. We got a hell of a fright, put it that way. Hill descent control is not as abrupt as it is in the Prado, but not as smooth as it is in the Everest. The Pajero Sport is capable of doing everything the others can do, but it and the Fortuner simply do it all with a gruff edge. Next up is the Everest, which is generally smooth, and perhaps because of that it tends to yield a driving experience that, while fuss-free, feels a bit removed from the terrain you're on. Having said that, there is a lot to like about the Everest. Steering is super light, but it doesn't quite have the direct feel of the Prado. The Everest's 2-litre 4-cylinder bi-turbo diesel engine and 10-speed auto are a very agreeable matchup, and just at home powering the Ford on terrain like this as it is cruising city and suburban streets. Its hill descent control system is one of the best of this bunch, delivering a controlled and sustained momentum, and it's never abrupt or harsh. The Everest sometimes does feel its bulk on tighter points along bush tracks, and it does take concentrated driving to keep it out of mischief. The Everest is very impressive at many aspects of four-wheel driving, but never quite as comfortably capable as our off-road winner. The Prado has the second lowest claimed ground clearance of this bunch, but that's never an issue because in the Prado it's easier to always place the wheels right where you want them. It feels like the best ready-to-go four-wheel drive here. It has less torque than the Everest, but the Prado feels like it consistently gets all of its 450 Newton meters to the dirt, and it always has a real active driver-direct sense to it. The 2.8 4-cylinder turbo diesel engine is a gutsy unit and rarely stressed, and the Prado's clever 6-speed auto is a good, effective fit here. Steering is light and precise, and the Prado never feels like a cumbersome vehicle. It really does feel easy to steer around in the bush. And its suspension that you always assume is so road focused is also really adaptable at low speeds on the real lumpy, bumpy stuff. Add to that mix plenty of wheel travel, a solid off-road traction control system and an all-round touring-friendly setup, and you have a great four-wheel drive that, even though it's feeling a bit old, is more than capable of heavy off-road duties. The Prado is one of the few standard four-wheel drives you can drive straight out of the showroom and up a steep and rutted dirt track in the bush without any doubts about its ability to get you to the top.
During our testing, both on-road and off, we kept a tally of the fuel use of each of these vehicles. Now here you'll see the official claimed combined consumption. That's what each of the manufacturers reckons these SUVs should use in day-to-day driving. And here's what we saw in our real-world testing. We took these figures at the pump and it was across on-road, off-road, highway, urban, the whole gamut. So make up your own mind and see which one you think did the best out of these four. After a couple of days of intense testing across a mix of different scenarios, we've come up with a winner in this comparison test. On the on-road side of things, it was the Ford Everest, which impressed us most because it was comfortable, composed, and very practical as well. But off-road, it was a bit of a different story, Crafty.
Mate, it was very, very close, and these four are all very capable off-roaders. But for me, the Prado just pips him, mate. It's just that little bit better at everything, at high and low speeds, high range, low range, four-wheel driving. It's just a tiny bit better.
So we've got two different winners in the two different sections, but what about the rankings overall? Well, here's that information.
If you want to know how we got to those rankings, read the full comparison at the CarsGuide website.
And if you're watching on YouTube, you'll find the link in the description below. And if you are watching still on YouTube, hit the like button, share this video with your friends, and also subscribe and hit the bell notification icon so you can stay up to date with all our latest videos and comparison tests.